The first thing they told Marcus Webb when he joined the Army was that he documented too much. His co in basic called it a nervous habit. His therapist called it a coping mechanism. Marcus called it the only way he knew how to keep the world in order: write it down, record it, make the chaos legible. He kept a voice memo app running during artillery drills. He logged the serial number of every weapon he cleaned. When his unit shipped to the forward operating base outside Kandahar, he filed handwritten notes on the smell of the dust, the way the generator hummed in a minor key, the exact pitch of the call to prayer drifting over the wire at 4:30. He was not sentimental. He was precise. There is a difference. There had been a psychiatrist at Fort Bragg who told him it was a form of anxiety management. She said it with the kind of gentle authority that wasn't really asking his opinion, and he had listened and nodded and continued documenting everything, because the alternative, moving through the world without cataloging it, trusting his impressions instead of his records, felt like operating blind. He had read once that certain neurological profiles made people more attuned to environmental inconsistency. The article had been in a magazine in a waiting room at the VA, and he had not been able to finish it because the nurse had called his name before the third page, but the phrase had stayed with him: environmental inconsistency. The brain that noticed when something was wrong before it could say what. He had always had that. He had always thought it was a liability. He'd been out 18 months when the Army sent him a letter. Not the standard VA form letter, the one with the exhausted syntax of bureaucracy running on fumes. This one had a blue letterhead he didn't recognize, a P.O. box instead of an address, and 3 sentences that told him he'd been selected for a voluntary pilot medical evaluation program. Benefits included full physical, dental, blood work panel, neurological screening. Compensation, $300 and a government-issue travel voucher. It was a Tuesday. He had $41 in his checking account. He took the bus to Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, because the letter said to. He signed in at a security desk and got a visitor badge with his photo on it, which they took with a camera that he noted was not a standard security camera. The lens housing was wrong, the focal length longer than you'd need for a 10-foot desk, the kind of spec you use when you're trying to capture high-resolution biometric data from an object you're pretending to photograph casually. He noted this. He noted the badge number, 114, and the fact that the security guard had the slightly off quality of someone performing a role they had studied but not lived. Not nervousness, not incompetence, something else. The facility didn't look like much. A converted office park, the kind that used to house insurance adjusters or pharmaceutical reps. The signage read NORTHSTAR Health Solutions in that font that was designed to suggest competence without saying anything. The lobby smelled of ozone and something floral that wasn't quite lavender, lavender's cousin, the wrong kind of relative. A receptionist with a lanyard and a practiced smile handed him a clipboard. He sat in a chair that was too low and filled out his forms in block capitals the way the Army had trained him. And when she called his name, she mispronounced it, Webbs, not Webb, and he didn't correct her because he was used to that particular brand of dismissal. They walked him down a corridor. He noted the length, roughly 40 meters, drop ceiling, standard fluorescence, no windows. He noted the fire exit at the far end. He noted that the other doors along the hallway had no handles on the outside. Room 7 had an examination table and a woman in a white coat who introduced herself as Dr. Vaisva. She had the kind of face that had never shown surprise, not once in its life. She asked him to remove his shirt. She asked him about his deployment history, his sleep patterns, his dietary habits. She typed without looking at the keyboard. When she pressed the cold disc of the stethoscope against his chest, she listened for a beat too long, 2 beats, 3, and Marcus counted the seconds because that was the kind of person he was. "You have an unusual resting heart rate," she said. Not alarmed, more like a note made in passing, the way you might comment on an interesting rock formation. "Army will do that to you," he said. She smiled the smile that wasn't quite a smile and excused herself. He waited 11 minutes. He knew because he counted. He also knew because the second hand on the analog clock on the wall, the only analog clock he had seen in a facility this modern, which was itself worth noting, had a hiccup at the 40-second mark. Every rotation. Same hiccup. The kind of detail that was meaningless until it wasn't. The second person who came in was not Dr. Vaisva. He was taller than the doorframe should have comfortably allowed. He wore a coat similar to hers, white, but he moved in it the way a person moves in a costume rather than clothing, as if the garment had been chosen to communicate something rather than worn from habit. His hands, when he set the tablet down on the counter, had the wrong number of knuckles. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Wrong in the way that you know something is wrong before you can name it, the way a note played slightly flat sounds fine until you hear it again. Marcus said nothing. He looked at the man's hands. He looked at the doorframe. He looked at his own shoes on the linoleum. "You are Marcus Webb," said the man. It was not a question, and the voice was the right pitch, the right cadence, the right American flattening of vowels, but it came from somewhere that wasn't quite the throat. "Yeah," said Marcus. "Excellent," said the man. Marcus had learned in Kandahar that there were exactly two useful responses to a situation that had gone sideways in ways you hadn't anticipated. You could panic, which spent your resources before you even understood the problem, or you could go very, very still and let your brain catch up. He went very still. The man, the Nata man, set the tablet on the examination table beside Marcus's hip and swiped through something on the screen. The screen showed readouts, not the kind Marcus recognized from the Army's medical system. The kind you build from scratch when you need to measure things that standard instruments don't measure. "Your cardiovascular efficiency is 22% above the human norm," the Nata man said, with the flat affect of someone reading a bus schedule. "Your cortisol regulation is also atypical. Your pattern recognition scores are in the 99th percentile among the samples we have processed." "The samples," Marcus said. "Yes." "How many samples?" The Nata man tilted its head. It was a gesture copied from something it had observed, Marcus suspected, because it was a fraction of a second too slow. "We have been processing human biodata for approximately 60 of your years." Marcus looked at the door. No handle on the inside either. He had not registered that before. He registered it now. "What," he said carefully, "am I being classified for?" The Nata man looked at him with eyes that were almost right. "We are assessing which humans represent the highest potential yield for conversion." "Conversion," Marcus said. "Yes." "What does that mean?" "It means we intend to understand what makes certain humans function at elevated levels and replicate those parameters in a form that is more useful." A pause, during which the Nata man seemed to search for a word. "Controllable." Marcus nodded slowly. He noted the ceiling tiles, standard drop ceiling, the kind that lifts out. He noted the IV stand in the corner that no one had offered to explain. He noted the tray beside the examination table that had instruments on it that were not standard issue for any medical procedure he had ever had, including the field surgery in Helmand Province, when Kowalczyk had dug a fragment out of his shoulder with a pair of needle-nose pliers, and a level of calm that Marcus still hadn't entirely processed. "I'd like to leave now," Marcus said. "That option is currently unavailable," said the Nata man. It said it the way you'd say the printer is out of paper, not cruel, just matter of fact, as if his preference was a minor logistical inconvenience rather than a human right. Marcus breathed in through his nose. He breathed out through his mouth. He said, "Okay." The Nata man looked at him. It was hard to say what made it wrong exactly. Marcus had spent time around people from enough different cultural backgrounds that he was accustomed to the small variance in human expression. The differences in baseline eye contact, in how much face space a person occupied during a conversation, in the precise social choreography of what to do with your hands. The Nata man was somewhere outside all of those variants. It wasn't that it looked alien. It was that it looked like a very good attempt at not looking alien, and very good attempts, by definition, still fall short. The skin on its face moved with a slight latency, as if the muscles underneath were receiving instructions rather than generating expressions. The eyes were still in the way that human eyes are never quite still. Human eyes microsecond constantly, tiny involuntary movements that track the world even when you're holding your gaze steady. The Nata man's eyes did not do this. Still, the word was still. Everything that lived on Earth was in constant minor motion. Only one kind of thing was that still. Marcus said nothing. He breathed. He filed the observations under ongoing and started the next category. And he started documenting. He did it the way he had always done it, in his head first, cataloging everything in the room with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that survival is mostly a matter of knowing more about your environment than your environment expects you to. The ceiling, drop tile, suspended grid, weight-bearing at approximately every 60 centimeters. The ventilation duct above the second tile from the left was slightly out of alignment, installed by something that had not quite understood the tolerances. The IV stand, chrome, base on wheels, locking casters. The instrument tray, 4 items he didn't recognize, one that looked close enough to a surgical clamp that he filed it under surgical clamp. The tablet the Nata man had carried, unlocked, screen still active, showing his readouts in a script he couldn't read but whose layout was close enough to a standard data table that he could infer column headers from position. The Nata man said it was going to retrieve its colleagues and begin the initial calibration procedure. It said this without inflection. It said this as if he were a piece of equipment being readied for maintenance. Then it left through the door, which locked from the outside with a sound he clocked at roughly a 1/4-inch deadbolt, not a mag lock, which mattered. Marcus counted to 3. Then he got off the table, picked up the instrument that was close enough to a surgical clamp, and went to work on the ceiling tile. The space above the drop ceiling was 22 inches of darkness and HVAC ducting. He pulled himself up one-armed, the other hand keeping the tile quiet, and lay flat on the suspended grid and breathed. Below him, he heard the door open and the Nata man return with what sounded like 2 others. He heard the sounds of equipment being moved. He heard the Nata man say something in a language that was made mostly of tones rather than consonants, and then he heard it say, in English, "The subject has vacated the examination space." There was a pause. And then, because it had apparently not occurred to them that the subject might have gone up rather than forward or sideways, he heard them move toward the door. Marcus exhaled. He began to move through the ceiling. He moved the way he'd moved through the service tunnels in Kandahar, slowly, weight distributed, no sudden shifts that would transmit vibration through the grid. The ceiling stretched in 3 directions from room 7. He chose the direction away from the footsteps and moved parallel to the corridor he'd been walked down, tracking distance by counting ceiling tiles. Each tile was approximately 60 centimeters. He needed 40 tiles to reach the far end of the building. He passed above a room that smelled of blood and copper and something underneath both that had no human referent. He stopped above it and held himself still on the grid and breathed through his mouth until the smell was distant enough to think around. Someone had been in that room recently. More than one someone. The smell was layered, oldest underneath, freshest on top, and the freshest layer was not old. Hours, not days. He filed this under reasons to move faster and moved faster. He made it to 14 before he found the other man. He almost put his hand through the ceiling tile directly on top of him, which would have been a problem, but he caught the slight depression in the grid, extra weight, and stopped. He eased the tile aside a centimeter and looked down. A man was sitting against the wall of what had been a server room. He was maybe 50, built like someone who had once been built very well and had since been imprecise about maintenance. He had a beard that suggested the last 3 weeks had been unkind to him, and he was wearing a hospital gown, and the expression of a man who had been angry for so long that the anger had calcified into something quieter and more durable. The man looked up at the gap in the ceiling where Marcus was looking down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Army," the man on the floor said. He was looking at Marcus's posture, the way his weight was distributed across the grid. "Used to be," Marcus said. "Air Force," said the man. "Sergeant Major retired. Name's Decker, Carl Decker." He said it the way people from the military always say their name, last name first in their heads even when they say it the other way. "You figured out the ceiling." "You didn't." "Figured it out 2 days ago," Decker said. "Couldn't move without the grid shifting. It's rated for light HVAC access, not a person my size." He looked at Marcus, who was lean and precise in the way of someone who had learned to be. "You might make it." "How long have you been here?" 9 days. He said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. "They've taken me to the processing room 3 times. I don't remember what happens in there. I wake up back here with new bruises and they've taken more blood. Whatever they're doing it slow." "What do you know about the layout?" Decker almost smiled. "That's the right question." He settled back against the wall. "Main corridor runs east-west. We're on the south side. There are at least 6 other subjects in cells on this level. I've heard them. The processing room is at the east end of the building, and there's a room on the west end past the lobby that they keep locked even from each other. I heard 2 of them arguing about it. The sound they make when they argue is it's not something you forget." "What's in the locked room?" "I don't know. But they argued about it for 20 minutes and one of them was afraid of it. I've had 9 days to listen to these things. The one that came to talk to me was never afraid of anything. Not once. And then it heard something from that room and it was afraid." Marcus cataloged this. "I need to get to the west end of the building, and I need to get everyone out." Decker looked at him for a long moment. "You've been here for what, an hour?" "About that." "And you're planning a breakout." "I'm planning an extraction," Marcus said. The distinction was real to him. Breakout implied desperation. Extraction implied methodology. Decker's almost smile went all the way. "Okay," he said. "Here's what I know." He knew quite a lot, and he delivered it with the clipped, structured efficiency of a man who had spent decades writing intelligence reports. No preamble, no drama. Just data in the order of its tactical relevance, the same way you'd brief a strike team. Situation first, then assets, then vulnerabilities, then timeline. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was the right response to a man giving a briefing, and noted everything in the same internal register he used for everything else. 9 days of forced inactivity had been spent productively by a man who had spent a career in a branch of the military that prioritized observation and pattern recognition. He knew the not-human shift cycle. They ran on a roughly 18-hour clock, not 24, which meant their changeover happened at irregular intervals relative to Earth time, but was predictable once you understood the underlying rhythm. He knew there were 7 of them in the building. He knew that 4 of them operated in what he called the intake wing, the east end, and 3 in the locked section at the west. He knew that the fire suppression system was still a standard earth-issue wet pipe system, because he'd heard it cycle its pressure test, which meant there was a main valve somewhere in the building that fed real water through real pipes. "Water," Marcus said. "They hate it," Decker said. "Not like not screaming, more like they stop, like it interrupts something. Second time they brought me to the processing room, I was wet from sweating, and the one doing the procedure kept breaking contact with my skin, kept recalibrating. Whatever they use to read us, water messes with the signal." Marcus thought about this. He thought about wet pipe fire suppression systems and main valves, and the layout of a converted office park. He thought about the fact that the not-humans had been running a covert medical evaluation program for 60 years, and apparently had never once encountered a subject who documented everything with the disciplined precision of a man whose brain had been made for exactly this kind of problem. "I'm going to the West Room," Marcus said. "What I find there I'm going to use. Stay ready." Decker looked up at him. "I've been ready for 9 days." Marcus moved. The ceiling grid was thin but consistent, and he had learned within the first 30 feet the exact amount of pressure each strut could absorb before it transmitted vibration to the tiles below. He moved in a rhythm that matched the HVAC cycling, every shift of his weight timed to the system's low hum, which ran at a frequency that covered a surprising amount of mechanical noise. He had learned this in Kandahar. White noise and engine sound covered footsteps. Air circulation covered breathing. The trick was to make yourself another part of the building's ambient sound signature. He counted tiles, past where he estimated the lobby, past a room that smelled of something acrid and chemical, some compound his body recognized as wrong before his brain caught up, past a room where he heard the tone language more clearly, 3 voices in a rhythm that sounded almost like argument but was probably something else, something for which he didn't have vocabulary. Past a space that was darker than the others, no light bleeding up through the tile gaps. He stopped above the dark space. He pressed his palm flat against the tile and felt for vibration. Nothing. He eased the tile aside. The room below was not empty, but what was in it was not a person. It was a console, if you called it that, a curved bank of hardware that followed a logic he couldn't map onto any computing architecture he recognized, with surfaces that shifted between matte and luminous without any pattern he could detect. Along the far wall were racks of equipment. Some of it was opaque to him entirely. Some of it was opaque in a way that was frustrating, because he could almost read the function from the form, the way you can almost identify a word in a language you don't speak from the shape of the sounds. And some of it was not opaque at all. Some of it was earth-sourced, captured, modified, repurposed, but the substrate was human manufacture, plastic housings, circuit board green. The particular color of American military-grade cabling, which he recognized because he'd spent 8 years surrounded by it. Stolen, studied, reverse-engineered, or simply integrated. And on the console's surface, glowing in the notation he couldn't read, a display that he cataloged as a status board. 70 or 80 entries, some in columns that looked like they corresponded to the cells in the intake wing, some in a separate column that he could not parse, and one entry, isolated in the upper left corner of the display, that was marked in a different color, a deep amber, and was cycling through a slow pulse like a heartbeat or a countdown. Marcus dropped into the room. He landed in a crouch, weight forward, and stayed there listening. 30 seconds, nothing. He breathed through his mouth again and cataloged the smell. Ozone, that same almost lavender compound from the lobby, and underneath both of them something that was not electrical burn, but shared some qualities with it. The smell of a process he couldn't name occurring in materials he didn't fully recognize. He gave himself another 10 seconds. He gave himself these seconds deliberately because the instinct under pressure was always to move, and the instinct under pressure was frequently wrong. You moved when you knew what you were moving toward. He looked at the room from his crouch and he built a map of it before he stood up. Console, curved against the far wall, approximately 3 meters wide, surfaces shifting between luminous and matte. Racks, 2 rows, left side and right, running the length of the room. Floor, not linoleum, something that absorbed sound. His landing had been quieter than he expected. That was worth knowing. Ceiling, lower than the main corridor, which meant the drop grid was only 14 inches up, which meant if he needed to disappear quickly he'd need to go out through the door rather than up. He filed this. He went to the racks. He went methodically, the way he'd been trained, the way he did everything, left to right, top to bottom, function before aesthetics. The Earth origin equipment had been modified, but the base language was familiar enough to trace. He found what looked like a network switch with its firmware replaced. He found a power conditioning unit with new inputs. He found, on the lowest shelf, something that looked like nothing so much as a military-grade signal jammer with approximately twice the power output of any jammer he'd ever handled, retrofitted with alien components that he couldn't name but could observe. They were warm to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with electrical resistance, and they pulsed in the same rhythm as the amber display. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. He thought about the fire suppression system. He thought about water and signal interference. He thought about the fact that whatever this device was, it pulsed in the same rhythm as whatever the amber entry on the display was counting toward. He thought about the Nata man saying, 60 years of samples, and the flat affect of someone reading a bus schedule, and the 11 minutes he had spent counting the hiccup in the second hand of the only analog clock in the building. He thought about the fact that analog clocks don't hiccup, not unless something nearby is putting out a field that affects the movement of metals. He looked at the device in his hands. He thought about what it would mean if a signal jammer built for human military applications had been amplified and converted into something that maintained the field that made this facility invisible or undetectable or both. He thought about what would happen if that field dropped. He thought about what Carl Decker had said. They argued about this room for 20 minutes, and one of them was afraid. Marcus set the device on the floor. He took the surgical clamp from his pocket. He'd kept it because that was the kind of person he was, and he began to remove the alien components from the jammer, not to destroy them, to understand them. To understand them the way you understand a weapon by disassembling it, by seeing what each part requires of the others, which pieces are load-bearing and which are redundant, where the system is strong and where it is assuming cooperation it can't afford to assume. He worked the way he did everything, without hurry, because hurry was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only advantage he had. The alien components were connected to the jammer's output stage in a way that had a logic he could not fully parse, but could partially reverse engineer by tracing what each addition had disrupted. This was how you understood a modification, not by understanding the modifier's intent, but by understanding what the original design had done and mapping the delta. What the jammer had once broadcast on, it no longer could. What it had once been tuned to suppress, it now ignored. The alien additions had redirected its output into a frequency band that the device had not been built for, which meant the original electronics were stressed, running hotter than designed, pulling more current, and the alien components were managing that stress through a process he couldn't observe but could infer from the heat pattern on the circuit board. He removed each alien component with the patience of a man who did not lose things. He placed each one on the floor to his left in the order of removal. He labeled them in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 components. He traced the connections back to factory state, which he could do because the modification had been additive rather than destructive. They had added to the jammer without removing anything from it, which meant the original design was intact underneath, waiting. This, too, was worth knowing. They studied, they modified, they built on top of what already existed. They did not understand things from the inside out, they understood them from the outside in. Whatever they were doing with 60 years of human biodata, they were doing it by addition and overlay, not by fundamental comprehension. That was their vulnerability. You can only modify what you don't understand up to the point where the thing you're modifying decides to do something you didn't anticipate. It took him 19 minutes. He knew because he counted. When he was done, he had a pile of 5 components that he didn't understand, and an Earth origin signal jammer that he did. He also had a theory. He climbed back into the ceiling. He moved faster now, back east toward the intake wing, back over the server room where Decker was waiting. He came down through the tile, dropped to his feet, and crouched in front of the Air Force man. Decker had not moved. He had the stillness of someone who had learned to wait without spending themselves in the waiting. "The West Room," Marcus said. "It's their ops center, and they've got a signal device in there, Earth origin jammer, military grade, modified. It's maintaining some kind of field. I think it's what's been making this place invisible to outside detection." Decker looked at him steadily. "You think or you know?" "I think," Marcus said, "but I'm right." He said it without arrogance because it wasn't arrogance. It was pattern recognition. It was 60 tiles counted with precision. It was the hiccup in the clock. It was the amber pulse on the display. "I need to activate it, the original function, strip the modification and run it as what it was built to be, a jamming device. Wide band. If I'm right, it'll disrupt whatever field they're maintaining, and it'll disrupt their internal communications simultaneously. And if you're wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now." Decker thought about this for exactly the amount of time it deserved. "The other subjects," he said, "6 of them that I know of, maybe more." "I know. You need to get them out before you activate anything. Once their communications go down, they'll move to secure the subjects." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I need you to be a distraction." Decker looked at him. "Not a sacrifice," Marcus said. "A distraction, there's a difference." Decker was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" Marcus told him. It took 90 seconds. When he was done, Decker nodded once, the way career military men nod when they've absorbed a briefing, not enthusiasm, not reluctance, just the clean uptake of a plan understood. "Give me 10 minutes, Decker said. "You'll have 8. Decker almost smiled again. 15. 12, Marcus said. "And then I go." He went back into the ceiling. The fire suppression riser was exactly where a standard office building layout suggested it would be, in the utility closet adjacent to the stairwell, accessible from the corridor rather than the ceiling. But the ceiling gave him the angle he needed to identify the valve through the gap between a conduit run and the north wall. He moved to position himself above the utility closet, eased the tile, dropped into the closet, and stood in the dark and the smell of mineral water and pipe rust, and counted to 12 minutes in his head. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds he heard Decker. What Decker did was simple and effective, and very loud. He had positioned himself in the server room for 9 days with nothing to do but think. And what he had thought about included the emergency lighting strip that ran along the corridor at baseboard level, which was wired separately from the main grid, and therefore had its own breaker. And the breaker was in a panel in the server room that was not locked, because the not-humans had apparently not considered that a man in a hospital gown who had been in a medically induced haze for 9 days would think to look for it. Decker threw every breaker in the panel at once. The facility went dark and loud simultaneously. The emergency strips cut to battery, which meant they flickered rather than held, strobing white light down the corridor in an irregular pulse that was disorienting by design, and the HVAC cycled off, which changed the building's ambient sound signature enough that every noise became suddenly, nakedly audible. He heard the not-humans moving. He heard the tone language, rapid and angular. He heard doors opening. He opened the main fire suppression valve. The wet pipe system did what wet pipe systems do. It fed water under pressure to all the sprinkler heads throughout the building simultaneously, and when those heads sensed the pressure, they opened, and what happened next was not subtle. Water came down through the ceiling of every room and corridor in the facility in sheets, and in the flickering emergency light it turned the space into something that looked like the inside of a cloud. Cold, loud, saturating. Marcus moved out of the utility closet and down the corridor at a run. He had 2 objectives and he had to execute them in sequence. First, the subjects. He hit the first door and found it unlocked. The power interruption had released the maglock, which was standard fail-safe behavior for fire safety compliance, which meant that whatever the not-humans had done to convert this facility, They had been smart enough to pass the fire inspection. He pulled the door open and found a woman inside, late 30s, civilian, curled against the far wall with her arms around her knees, and said, "Federal evacuation. Move with me." Because that was the phrase most likely to produce immediate compliance in a civilian who was already terrified and he wasn't above using it. She moved. He hit the next 5 doors in sequence, moving fast and keeping his voice low and even, the voice you used when you needed people to comply before they had time to process their own fear. He said the same things each time because consistency was calming and panic was contagious and there was no time for either. Federal evacuation. Move with me. Stay close. Keep moving. A man in his 60s who walked with a limp that suggested an old injury rather than a fresh one. He'd been compensating for years. His gait was adapted. He would not slow them down. He moved at pace without complaint and without asking questions, which Marcus noted approvingly. A young woman who came out of her room already running, who had clearly been waiting for exactly this, who fell into formation behind the older man with the instinctive sense of someone who had assessed the situation and made her peace with following competent leadership. 2 men who looked like they'd been there longer than Decker, thin, pale, moving with the careful economy of people who had been conserving resources, who had learned in whatever time they'd spent in those rooms to spend nothing they didn't have to spend. They held each other's eyes for a moment when they came out into the corridor, a look that carried the entire weight of however many days they had been kept apart, and then they moved. The last room held a teenage boy. He couldn't have been more than 16. He was sitting on the examination table in the center of the room, and he was holding himself very still with the focused intentionality of someone who had been doing it for a long time. The stillness of someone who had decided that the safest thing was to take up as little space in the world as possible. When the door opened and Marcus said, "Federal evacuation, move with me," the boy looked at him with eyes that were trying to do math they didn't have enough data for. Marcus crossed the room. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and he said, "I've got you." The boy grabbed Marcus's wrist with both hands and didn't let go. Marcus did not tell him to let go because there are some things a person needs, and the need is the need. He moved them down the corridor toward the fire exit. He counted heads, 6 plus himself. Decker was not among them. He had to trust Decker. He did not like trusting. He preferred verification. But there was no time to verify Decker, and Decker had an Air Force man's bearing and an Air Force man's stillness, and Marcus had learned to read men under pressure and Decker read clean. He trusted Decker. He hit the fire exit bar at a jog and came out into North Carolina night air, and the smell of pine and wet earth, and a sky full of stars that were real stars, not lights, not signals, not the amber pulse of a countdown on an alien display, just the accumulated light of a universe that was vast and indifferent and beautiful in the way that only vast and indifferent things can be. He stopped, he turned, he counted heads again. 6, plus the teenager who still had his wrist, 7 with Marcus. No Decker. He looked at the people around him, the woman from the first room, the limping man, the young woman who'd already been running, the 2 thin men, the boy. They were wet and cold and blinking in the dark, and they were looking at him because he was the one who had come through the ceiling and opened the doors, and he was aware of what that meant, that they needed him to be the thing that knew what happened next. "Into the tree line," he said. "North, move quietly. Don't stop." He said it the way he'd been trained, with the calm that is not the absence of fear but its management, because he had learned that the people around you can carry your tone the way they cannot carry your panic, and a calm voice is the most load-bearing thing a human being can offer another. They moved. He went back inside. He knew it was operationally questionable. He knew Decker might already be gone the way the others were gone, the way the father in the tunnel had gone, engulfed in light, somewhere that Marcus couldn't follow. He had thought about that image, some version of it, reconstructed from what he'd read in the debrief files he wasn't supposed to have seen, the ones from the families who came to the office park and told their stories to people who listened with the careful neutrality of people who didn't believe them. He had thought about that image of a person entering a tunnel and not coming out, and about the abandoned vehicles left behind, and about how that was what this whole operation looked like from the outside. You just didn't come back. You went in for a checkup, and there was no record of you leaving, and eventually, someone found your car at the edge of a parking lot or didn't find anything at all, because the field had been running for 60 years, and it was very good at making things invisible. He knew that his first obligation was to the people he'd gotten out, not the one he'd left behind, and that going back in was the kind of decision that got people killed in ways that were statistically preventable. He went back in anyway. He went fast, back through the fire exit, back into the water-streaming strobing corridor. The suppression system had been running long enough that there was standing water on the floor now, a quarter-inch in the low spots, and it caught the emergency lights in quick silver flashes as he ran through it. The corridor smelled of wet ceiling tile and the underlying chemical floral scent of the facility, and something underneath both of those that was new, sharp, and metallic and hot, the way a circuit board smells right before it fails. He ran west because west was the ops room and Decker had known about the ops room, and if Decker had moved from the server room, it would have been toward the thing that mattered, not away from it. He had known Decker for 40 minutes. He trusted him. He was aware that this was not a statistically sound basis for the level of trust he was extending, and he was also aware that some things you know about a person in 40 minutes that other people never know in 40 years. The specific quality of how they respond when the situation goes sideways, which is the only quality that matters. He found him in the corridor outside the ops room door. Decker was on his feet, which was the main thing, though his left arm was doing something anatomically improbable that Marcus filed under dislocated shoulder and did not address immediately. He was standing between the door and two of the not-humans, which was either an extraordinarily aggressive piece of distraction work or the specific look of a man who had been caught mid-objective and was refusing to cede the ground. Given what Marcus knew of Carl Decker in the last 40 minutes, he considered both equally likely. The not-humans were not moving. They stood in the spray of the suppression system, and Marcus could see it now, what Decker had described. They did not run, they did not attack. They stopped. The water was doing something to them, not painful, not immediately destructive, but interrupting, like a bad connection, like a signal dropping out. Marcus ran past all three of them into the ops room. He went to the rack. The jammer was where he'd left it, the 5 alien components lined up to the left on the floor in removal order. He looked at them one more time. He thought about the Nata man saying, 60 years. He thought about what 60 years of uninterrupted operation looked like from the inside of an intelligence infrastructure. The assumption of invisibility so deeply embedded that it had become structural. That was the thing about 60 uninterrupted years. You stopped checking for threats from directions you'd never been threatened from before. You stopped imagining the thing you hadn't encountered. You processed your samples and you ran your field and you cycled your shifts on your 18-hour clock, and you never once considered that one of your samples might go up through the ceiling. They had underestimated curiosity. That was the whole of it. Not strength, not combat ability, not some specifically human capacity for violence or heroism. Curiosity. The compulsion to document and understand and look at the clock and notice the hiccup and follow it to its source. They had taken 60 years of human biodata, and they had cataloged human performance in every dimension they could measure, and they had missed the one that mattered most. The desire to understand the thing you don't understand. The refusal to be in a room and not know what the room is. He went to the jammer. He went to the power conditioning unit. He thought about the way that human engineers design power interfaces. The standard is always more forgiving than the edge case. You build for worst-case input because you know someone will eventually do something inadvisable. And he connected the jammer to the conditioning unit with a cable that was 3/4 Earth origin and 1/4 something else, and he pressed the power button. The jammer's startup cycle ran for 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which the ops room was silent, except for the rain of the suppression system on the corridor floor outside, and the distant, arrhythmic sound of the not-humans in the hall trying to recalibrate their processes. 8 seconds that felt like longer. Then it ran. Marcus did not know exactly what the alien modification had been maintaining. He knew it had been maintaining something, from the amber pulse in Decker's account of the argument, and the single fact that a facility conducting covert medical evaluations on human subjects had been operating in a research Triangle Park office park for an unspecified number of years without anyone from the outside world apparently noticing. He suspected it was a broad-spectrum field. Detection suppression, signal masking, possibly some interference with human short-term memory consolidation in the immediate vicinity, which would explain why the building could run vans to and from it without anyone in the surrounding area retaining a clear impression of its activity. When the jammer hit full output, the field dropped. He knew it dropped because the amber entry on the status display stopped pulsing and went dark. He knew it dropped because the not-humans in the corridor behind him made a sound he had not heard before, a high harmonic, and the sound carried a quality that was unmistakably close enough to human panic that his body responded to it before his brain had finished processing it. He knew it dropped because, 17 seconds later, he heard the distant thrum of rotors. Military rotors. The specific frequency of Black Hawks, which he knew because he had ridden in and out of enough of them to have that particular sound permanently embedded in his auditory memory, alongside the generator hum in minor key, and the call to prayer at 4:30. He walked out of the ops room. The two not-humans in the corridor were on the floor. Not dead. He didn't know if they could die from water exposure, and it wasn't something he needed to determine right now, but down. Decker was sitting against the wall with his dislocated shoulder and an expression of immense, sustainable satisfaction. "Told you they hated water," Decker said. "You were right," Marcus said. 12 minutes, Decker said. 14. "I'll give you 14. He looked at the corridor, the water still sheeting down, the emergency lights still strobing. "How'd you know the jammer would work?" "I didn't," Marcus said. He reached down and offered his hand. "I thought." Decker took his hand and let Marcus pull him up, absorbing the movement through his good shoulder with the practiced adaptation of a man who had been making the best of imperfect situations for 30 years. What were the odds? "Good enough to try," Marcus said. They went out the fire exit together, into the pine and the stars and the sound of rotors getting louder, and Marcus counted heads in the tree line and found 7, which was 6 subjects plus a boy with both hands on someone else's arm now, the young woman who had already been running, and Marcus allowed himself one full breath of the kind that was not management or discipline, but just air, just the carbon dioxide of a body that was still functioning, still running, still here. The Black Hawks came down in the field north of the facility. The lights were blinding, which Marcus found both familiar and, for the first time, something close to welcome. Men in gear came out with the specific efficiency of people who had been wanting to get to this building for a long time and had just, inexplicably, suddenly been able to find it. Marcus stood in the rotor wash and the floodlight and let them come to him. The debrief took 11 hours. It took place in a basement room in a building he was not told the name of, with men and women who identified themselves by first name only and asked questions with the careful neutrality of people who had been briefed enough to know that the answers were going to require significant revision of several standing assumptions. He answered everything. He answered it in the block capital precision of a man who had been trained by the Army and further trained by the specific education of being the kind of person who notices the hiccup in the clock. He was not interested in sounding impressive. He was interested in being understood, which requires more care and is a different skill entirely. When they asked him how he had understood the jammer modification well enough to reverse it, he walked them through the logic step by step, from the heat pattern on the circuit board to the additive nature of the alien modification, to the inference he had drawn about an intelligence that understood human technology from the outside in rather than from first principles. Some of them had technical backgrounds. Some didn't. He calibrated. Decker was in the next room. Marcus could hear his voice through the wall, the flat, precise cadence of an Air Force man giving a briefing, not a testimony. Decker had been here 9 days and had used every one of them to build the situational awareness that had made his 14 minutes of distraction possible. And the people in the next room were going to have to work very hard to pretend that the Air Force hadn't, in this instance, been useful. At hour 7, a woman named Priya, first name only, set a tablet in front of him. It showed a readout. It took him a moment to recognize it as the readout from the alien console in room 7, photographed by someone with a very good camera and partially decrypted by someone with a very good mind. And he was surprised by how much of it he could now read, given that 40 minutes ago he hadn't been able to read any of it. Pattern recognition, the Nata man had said, 99th percentile among the samples we have processed. They were right, Priya said, following his eyes, about your profile. I know, Marcus said. They were going to convert you, she said, carefully, as if the word was a tool she was not certain was calibrated for this particular use. I know, he said, they were going to make me useful to them. Instead, Priya said. Instead, I was useful to me, Marcus said. And to the 8 people who are alive tonight who weren't going to be. Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the tablet over and slid a different document across the table. It had a blue letterhead and no address, and it was, he thought, either a very different kind of offer than the first letter or exactly the same kind of offer with different fine print. He looked at it, he looked at the letterhead. He thought about the jammer in the ops room, still running, broadcasting its disruption field into the surrounding area, and the people who had just spent 7 hours asking him questions with the careful neutrality of people rearranging their assumptions, and the 6 subjects from the cells who were in rooms upstairs being looked after by people with warm blankets and better answers than he'd been able to give them in the corridor. He thought about the Nata man saying, 60 years. 60 years of samples, and no one had come up through the ceiling. No one had documented the tiles and the clock and the cable gauge and the HVAC frequency. No one had looked at an alien signal jammer and understood it as what it was because they recognized the substrate underneath the modification. No one until a man who had been told, at every stage of his career, that he documented too much. What does this job involve? He said. Priya said, finding the next facility. Marcus looked at the document. He thought about the road that had always led back to the same tunnel, the same lights, the same abandoned cars, the same field of blinding light that had been swallowing people in North Carolina for 60 years, and before that, the same mountain, the same darkness, the same alien pattern running its cycle without interruption. He thought about what it would mean to interrupt a cycle. To find it and name it and map it and come down through the ceiling at it with a jammer and 14 minutes of distraction, and the precise, documentary, excessive attention of a human mind that had been built for exactly this. He picked up the pen. It was a government pen ballpoint, the kind with the specific drag that government pens always have, and he thought briefly about how no alien in 60 years of processing human samples had apparently ever thought to study the ballpoint pen, which was one of the most human objects ever made, cheap, imperfect, ubiquitous, designed to be lost and replaced and not mourned. A writing instrument for a species that needed to document everything because the world was chaos, and the only answer to chaos was to write it down. He signed his name, block capitals, the way the army had trained him. Then he set the pen down and said, "I need a voice memo app." Priya looked at him. "For the debrief," he said, "I'm going to start from the beginning." He started from the beginning. He started with the bus to research Triangle Park, and the receptionist who mispronounced his name, and the corridor with no handles on the outside of the doors. And he described it all with the methodical, patient, excessive attention of a man who had been told too many times that he documented too much, and who had finally, definitively, been proven right about the value of that habit in the specific circumstance of surviving an alien medical processing facility in North Carolina by knowing, precisely and without any doubt, that the ceiling tiles were spaced 60 centimeters apart. 3 weeks later, a classified memo circulated within a very small office in a building without a name. It described a human subject who had not only escaped an alien processing facility, but had identified and neutralized its concealment infrastructure using only a signal jammer, an HVAC cycle, a fire suppression valve, and the systematic documentation of every environmental detail in a room he had occupied for 11 minutes. The memo classified him under a designation that had not previously existed in the program's taxonomy. The designation was 3 letters, followed by a number, followed by the word anomaly. Decker saw the memo. He was in the next office, which he now occupied on a more permanent basis, and he had a functional shoulder again, and a title that was also classified, and a coffee mug that said Air Force in block letters, and a window that faced north, toward the mountains. He read the memo, he read the designation. Then he picked up his phone and called the number that went to the office 2 floors down, where Marcus Webb was sitting at a desk with a voice memo app running, documenting everything, and he said, "They classified you." "I know," Marcus said. "Anomaly," Decker said. "I know. That bother you?" Marcus thought about the Nata man with its almost right eyes saying, "The highest potential yield for conversion." He thought about what that meant, that the thing his brain had always done, the excessive, methodical, undiscourageable attention to the world it was given, had looked to an alien intelligence processing 60 years of human data like the most dangerous thing they had encountered. Not strength, not aggression, not firepower. Documentation, pattern recognition, the refusal to move through the world without naming it first. "No," Marcus said, "it doesn't bother me." He looked at the window, not mountains from his window, an office park, the kind that had once housed insurance adjusters or pharmaceutical reps, standard, invisible, the kind of place you walk past and don't remember. He had learned in the last 3 weeks to look at those very carefully. "There's a facility in Arizona," he said. "I've been looking at the satellite data. There's an office park in Tempe with a parking lot camera that points the wrong way." "Wrong way how?" Decker said. "Wrong way like it was installed by something that understood the concept of cameras, but not the purpose," Marcus said. "It's facing the building instead of away from it." There was a pause. He could hear Decker processing this, the way Decker processed things in long, Air Force patient silence. "Arizona," Decker said. "Arizona," Marcus said. "I'll write it up." He opened a new document. He put the date at the top. He wrote in block capitals, the way the Army had trained him, and he started with the parking lot camera and worked outward from there, cataloging everything, naming the chaos, making it legible, the way he had always done, the way he had always been told was excessive, the way that had brought him up through the ceiling of an alien medical facility in North Carolina and out the other side into the pine and the stars. Outside, a blue letterhead memo was being signed by someone in a building without a name. It authorized the next phase. It used a phrase Marcus would not see for several more weeks, but which would not surprise him when he did. It called him a classified weapon. He would have corrected the phrasing if he'd been there. Not a weapon, he'd have said, a method, there's a difference. But the pen had already moved. The document was already filed. And somewhere in a converted office park in Tempe, Arizona, a parking lot camera was pointing the wrong way, and no one had noticed. No one except Marcus Webb, who was already writing it down.